Welcome to part 2 of my review of The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom. This part 2 almost feels more special than part 1. It not only is the 70th review still, but it's my last video for a very long time. Plus, it's freaking Tears of the Kingdom, and my experiences with the game prompted me to want to talk about it a lot, to the point where I want to review a game without worrying about spoilers for my first time. That's right, you're going to see a lot of stuff from the game, including the final boss and stuff. I'm not going to be careful at all of what gameplay footage I include with any and every stage of what I recorded of my journey accompanying this review script. If you want to see my general thoughts about the game without spoiling yourself, see my part 1 review. But if you've done all the main quests, as much of the side content as possible, or you don't even want to play this game at all yet want to hear me talk about it, then this is the Viddy Reviews Tears of the Kingdom video for you. When I finished my part 1 review video, I had played the game for near countless hours and completed all the main quests and did as much of the side content as possible. Then I went on a trip for a little over a month, and soon after returning, played Tears of the Kingdom for more and more hours still. Was the experience worse or better? Did absence make the heart grow fonder or not? Well, I can say that my opinions have not changed since I left, because the game kept on giving while still having problems. What I intend to do in this more in-depth spoiler-filled portion of my ongoing review of The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is talk more about the story and gameplay and progression. And boy, is there a lot to digest here, let alone compared to the preceding game. In fact, I've probably missed a few basic things I could have talked about in my part 1 video. But hey, we're going full-on analysis as much as possible here. So, enjoy. The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is, to me, the quintessential playground chatter game. But what do I mean by that? When I think of the earliest playground chatter example in gaming history, I think of the very first, The Legend of Zelda. This game dumped the player into this open world with little to no direction, and it was up to you to explore everywhere possible and get to the ending. You had to find dungeons, items, and secrets. While these could be found with at the time, Nintendo Power Guides or on the internet nowadays, the experience of playing The Legend of Zelda was enriched by the questions and statements exchanged between people. Hey, did you complete that dungeon? It was cool. I found this secret cave. Of course, The Legend of Zelda is probably not the first example of this. Heck, even Super Mario Bros. Secrets were constantly talked about. But I think The Legend of Zelda epitomizes this. Tears of the Kingdom, and to an extent its predecessor, Breath of the Wild, is the equivalent of the playground chatter of the very first game of the series. The problem is, these games are extremely huge, with Tears of the Kingdom adding more to Breath of the Wild than was probably ever thought possible. You can go in even more directions than ever, and you can put off main content or even side content for hours before realizing that you may have come across the playground chatter for the game online and realize you've seen something you didn't want to see or wonder if you're going in the wrong direction. Hey, did you see the jumping from ship to ship stuff to get to the Wind Temple? It was cool. What? I've been playing for 20 hours and I've not come across that, not even my first dungeon. I've just been spending time doing shrines and stuff. This game keeps on distracting me and stuff. How have people already got the Master Sword? How have people already completed this? Did they rush it or something? Well, that mostly hypothetical discourse is a good opportunity to talk about the general map designs and how they differ from Breath of the Wild, including the sense of freedom and exploration. It goes without saying that Tears of the Kingdom is the definition of a direct sequel, and the marketing with the trailers and press statements did not shy away from this. In fact, it was stated fairly early on that the map was mostly going to be the same. How do you make a game that has a similar map, not to mention similar production values with how it may look and sound, a sequel? Is there going to be a sense of deja vu constantly that could largely remove a sense of freedom and discovery? Is it going to be down to the gameplay mechanics, structure, completely new areas, and even story to make this game stand out from Breath of the Wild? Well, if the preceding game was about providing the biggest open world in the Legend of Zelda series of that time and potentially give the player a magical smorgasbord of exploration and discovery, Tears of the Kingdom feels like a return to home, well, a big home, with changes to the content that allow for a lot more experimentation than was previously imagined or even given to the player through the game development process. The main structure of Breath of the Wild consisted of exploring the surprisingly large tutorial area, then looking for Impa in Kakariko Village, who directs you to uncover several locked memories and go to 4 regions that each contain a main dungeon. All this while having the option to defeat the final boss at nearly any time. Oh, and there were shrines and side content and stuff. Tears of the Kingdom follows this non-linear main quest chapter structure in a fairly similar way, but features more main quests to do. The main quests begin in the tutorial-based Great Sky Island, which soon leads Link to the surface, where the openness of the game begins proper. When you land onto the surface, much of the world may appear the same as before, but when you start exploring, some of the changes become more apparent, least of all a tree that comes to life and attacks Link. One of the more startling differences early on is that you can miss your paraglider. Your paraglider, the very item that signified the tutorial area in Breath of the Wild was over, can be overlooked if you focus on Ultra Hand themed inventions or wander around for a while once you start exploring the ground below the Sky Islands. This can make the earlier progression feel very overwhelming, unless you follow the main quest progression to the search party in Hyrule Castle and the Skyview Tower after. Now, what is similar and different about the ground map? Well, the geography is essentially the same, from the cold Hebrew region in the northwest to the Gerudo deserts in the southwest, and so on and so forth. Easily one of the biggest changes to the overworld are the caves, and these were kept a secret. For the most part, they generally contain little more than shrines, bubble frogs with gems, cave-specific enemies, not to mention entrances and exits that can be used for efficient traversal. However, there are at least a few caves, such as the one next to the Lookout Landing Shelter and Hyrule Castle, that are bigger and more like a maze. The relative lack of a map feels like a callback to the cave explorations in old adventure games, including the adventures that inspired the Legend of Zelda series in the first place. It is also tantalizing when you realize that seeing a cute and mysterious rupee-filled bloopy creature is an indication you're close to the mouth of a cave. The only drawback with caves is that destroying rocks for materials or progression can get tedious while you're managing your rock hammers and an explosive roll from a sage over and over again. Outside of the caves, the ground is affected by ruins, fallen rubble, and most of all the populations of Hyrule rebuilding the towns and so on after the Great Calamity. A few years in passing makes it all the more interesting for those who have played Breath of the Wild just to see what everyone has been up to and what new quests there are to do. However, there are a few problems. Familiarity and consistency. While the changes to the overworld are actually noticeable, you will come across several locations that either have the exact same things or nothing. No changes from last time. It can sometimes feel like you're traversing the same fields, rock faces, sands, water and so on from before. Then again, if you've not played Breath of the Wild for a while, like I have, you can feel a mixture of forgetfulness and familiarity, while the location and quest alterations will provide even the most seasoned veterans all the more content and landscapes to uncover at their own pace. With consistency, not all characters remember Link. You know, the legendary hero with a reputation to save the world from a great calamity, the legendary hero that even rebuilt Tarrey Town and even made a new house for himself and Zelda in Hateno Village? Some characters do remember him or give him a positive reception like the Gerudos do, but Tarrey Town's residents mostly don't remember him? Maybe the horses that can be carried over from your Breath of the Wild so far remember Link, but that is on my Wii U, so points docked for inconsistency anyway. Still, there are 2 new map layers that are all new designs. The first new layer to the map is the Sky Islands. The Sky Islands were in part one of the first new exciting areas dropped in the trailers and demonstrations. 2 of the thoughts that came to mind early on was, will the game begin in the sky? And what ways will be there to get to these Sky Islands besides using recall on fallen ruins on the ground? Well, the Great Sky Island is the tutorial equivalent of Breath of the Wild's Great Plateau and is also the largest island in the sky. The Great Sky Island, however, is more of a linear exploration done in a circle around shrines. You can go off a linear path still to find some collectibles, battles and Koroks, but the pacing and progression here is deliberate. The 4 new abilities are still really cool though, so it doesn't really matter. However, if this island may as well be the equivalent of Skyloft in this game, are the other islands really worth exploring? Well, the good thing is that the draw distance here is better than in The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword. You see some structures from far away, you can most likely get to them. But the question is, how? Well, I can say first that not all rocks on the ground that can be interacted with using recall lead up to the sky as interpreted in the gameplay demonstration. A great many of them just go up high enough to give you an opportunity to skydive down to something of interest on the ground. Instead, the other way to get to these sky islands is a subtle stroke of genius, as well as an elaboration of what was mostly a decent and overused gameplay mechanic of before: towers. The Skyview towers on the ground reveal a region of a map like they did last time, but they also launch Link very high into the sky so you can glide and skydive. Opening these towers to use them are also a lot of fun. In Breath of the Wild, all you mostly had to do was ascend to the top provided you had enough climbing stamina or were somewhat overpowered with Ali's Gale. Nearly all the towers in this game are a puzzle in themselves. Some towers are locked, some require you to ascend into them from below or descend into them from above, some require you to clear or bypass sludge or thorns around them, and one of these instances is a little tricky. Some require you to help one of the technicians every time it is interesting to solve a problem, and the reward being seeing Link up in the sky set to that rousing music never gets old. Now, these towers are usually within range of a series of sky islands, and this is where your paraglider is handy. Some of these islands are really far off, so having stamina upgrades, stamina elixirs, and a gust ability from a sage, that we'll talk about later, is imperative for getting to these. Depending on how much you have of any of these requirements, or if you see Zonai devices lying around, some of these islands are hard to get to. The Sky Islands are generally the most peaceful of all the places to explore in the game, owing to the atmosphere and music, so it was interesting to have challenges of traversal, complete with quite a few cannons around to launch Link in whatever direction you wanted. Sometimes it was nice to just rest on these islands to take a break from the surface and depths. Unfortunately, once you explore these other Sky Islands, the content of these Sky Islands is somewhat disappointing. There are little more to these islands than Zonai device capsule dispensers, shrines, Koroks, 2 main dungeons, not to mention stone slabs to take photos of for a long-running side quest, and of course, chests with weapons, items, and sage's wills. Granted, there are mostly tricky mini-bosses here. Some of the shrine puzzles here are fun, especially the Ultra Hand ones. There are mazes in the sky like there are or were on the ground, and of course the main dungeons here are important. But much of the sense of discovery here is somewhat unrewarding. Exploration around here is peaceful, but more probably should have been done other than just providing skydiving points to get to points of interest on the ground. Much of what is seen here, though, does offer a little insight on the Zonai civilization and their structures and technology that are scrutinized by the keenest of scholars on the ground. Below that ground, however, provides some of the most interesting and challenging exploration in all of the game: the depths. These depths were generally kept hidden from the pre-release material, or at the least were speculated on based on what little footage or screenshots there are. And oh, how glad I was that was the case. Deliberately inspired by Journey to the Center of the Earth, this underground area is a whole map itself lying under Hyrule. These are not islands like in the sky. This is a whole world covered in darkness and poisonous gloom and then some. The challenges here lie in visibility and hazards and tougher enemies. The only way to see through the overwhelming blackness is to sprout the near countless light bloom seeds you find or to activate light root beacons. Each of them makes it easier to see, but they do more than that. Each of the light root beacons lie underneath a shrine on the surface, with a shrine name spelled backwards underground. This also means that if you happen to find a shrine or light root first, you could go to its corresponding alternative above or below ground if you haven't discovered it already. The light roots, however, provide fast travel and resting points for Link to recover his lost maximum hearts from gloom that can be filled with health items if need be. One of the main problems with exploration in the depths, however, is the climbing. One great thing about above ground exploration is seeing a rock structure or mountain that is climbable and figuring out if you can make it. The climbing section of the darkness are really like that. I get that visibility is supposed to be low, but the rocky structures around impede exploration and are more frustrating than intriguing, until you realize the walls are representative of the edges of rivers, lakes, and oceans above. If only I figured that out sooner. The content is also a little limited again. Spread out through the depths are hundreds of little glowing pods which are a form of currency. They are easily spotted in the darkness and surprisingly provide a good indication of the ground that Link can walk on, which can allow the player to charge the elevations. There are also several bargainer statues around which accept the pose you give them, giving Link the very helpful Depths armor set that provides gloom resistance. vat or bomb flowers and dark clumps that can give you gloom resistance in the meantime, plus other items. There are a few boss fights, including the chance to have a rematch with dungeon bosses, coliseums with hordes of enemies, 2 dungeons, and a few locations that help with quests and zonite devices, but that is mostly about it. If you could deal with what is essentially fear of the dark in this new map, you can find some far more interesting content down here than what is up in the sky. Around this world, one has to take note of the physics, puzzles, and combat. The general gameplay loop of these will be familiar to Breath of the Wild veterans, but the differences make for some of the best designed elaborations on that game's open formula. Multiple solutions to a problem or puzzle are provided like last time, and generally let you do just about everything and anything your own way. The previously mentioned Ultra Hand ability feels like multiple abilities in one, over the 4 runes of Breath of the Wild. What that means is that Ultra Hand needs to link using insertable stakes, elemental emitters, items glued together for sometimes crazy physics, and of course vehicles for ground, aerial, and naval traversal, and the list goes on and on and on. Combine this with Ascend and Recall, and you've got some mostly inventive puzzles and obstacles to overcome. Toying around with Ultra Hand leads to some eye-opening moments. One of my favourites was the Fixed Device Shrine, where you realise that you can insert stakes into almost anything, including a device that rotates upon activating a switch. I toy around with where to insert the stake on this device until I insert it on the side and activate the device to make the stake rotate like a pinball table flipper, so it can push the ball in the direction of a target switch. Or you can just, fire a bomb arrow at the target. Little moments like this just made me feel like a genius, and I looked forward to moments like this every time I saw a shrine. The same giddy feeling applies to using these items in other ways in the overworld. And again, the aforementioned playground chatter comes into working other puzzles together, sometimes with a solution that the developers may as well have not intended.
Can I walk across this? Yes. What are you laughing about?
You came up with another solution out of 2 or 3 for that puzzle.
Guys! Yes! Told you this is the way. I told you. You guys didn't believe me.
However, there are problems with shrines that are unfortunately brought over from Breath of the Wild. A good many of them are, again, fairly easy or over before you realise it, unless you try to solve a secondary puzzle of getting a seemingly inaccessible treasure. And the worst part is the great many repeated shrines to fill out the count to 152, 120 of them on the ground, 32 in the sky. In Breath of the Wild, there were tests of strength and blessing shrines. Both of these consisted of fighting an enemy inside a shrine or solving a shrine quest in the overworld to get your prize afterwards. First of all, the shrine quests this time are interesting and sometimes challenging, such as making ice keys or using the light from the morning sun at a rotating zonite structure to cover a rock pattern in shadow. But again, you solve a puzzle like this like last time and just get a chest and an orb. The tests of strength are replaced with combat training and especially proving grounds that borrow from the memorable Eventide Island side quest of Breath of the Wild. These remove Link of everything he has except the bare minimum of weapons and items lying around the shrine to take out all the constructs in the most strategic way possible. When I came across my first proving ground, it was actually a little challenging, and I was delighted to call it an Eventide Shrine. However, there are 15 of those, though with sometimes really interesting differences. Add to that the 6 combat training ones, about 50 Warrior's Blessing ones, I might be off by 1 or 2 there, and that is, how many out of 152 again? The general shrine puzzle ratio could have been changed from Breath of the Wild. Shrines are generally fun and are great for exploration, as well as for understanding of your 4 abilities in the overworld and upgrading Link's health and stamina bars again, but the fun factor may not apply to players who wanted more dungeons that were longer and maybe more complex. We'll come back to the dungeons. Outside of puzzles and exploration, you will engage in combat like last time. It's just as challenging, maybe a little more so, where enemies will hit hard. There is thankfully a little more variety to the enemies this time around, ranging from the robotic constructs to the familiar bokoblins and moblins that can even wear armor, all with the potential to carry their own fused weapons. One of the concerns around whether the challenge is done right comes from fusing weapons. Fusing weapons not only make them last longer, sometimes longer than you realize, but also increases the attack power. When I attached a bokoblin arm to a stick giving it 27 attack power and dusted off 3 bokoblins in mostly one hit, it made me wonder if the combat is not balanced and just fusing weapons or arrows turn enemies into a joke. But the invisible levels/XP scaling system from Breath of the Wild that a number of people, myself included at first, may not know about is brought back. It would take too long to explain it in depth, including the new horn scaling that refers to attaching specific enemy horns to your weapons, but here goes. Depending on what rank of enemies you constantly fight, such as a mostly easy red bokoblin, and how well you do against them when it comes to parrying or not taking damage, the enemy and weapon ranks go up the further you play the game. So, say, hypothetically, you would come across an area that has the somewhat hard silver moblins, and you constantly defeated those, then the lower tier moblins would change to, or at least gradually change to, silver moblins, making combat harder. So, to scale with these enemies, the weapons you find lying around or in chests become stronger, and are also likely to be automatically fused combinations of a higher attack level that can, again, also include enemy horns. If you have the Master Sword that can temporarily break, or find really powerful gloom weapons and arrows that do high damage at the cost of Link's max health, it can feel like the game is easier over time after being somewhat hard at the beginning. But the enemy scaling does mean that parrying, dodging, special abilities such as flurry attacks, or even more fun combinations such as attaching to arrows the items with high attack power or elemental/explosive power have to be done as much as possible regardless of how easy or hard an enemy is. You also again have to increase your hearts and stamina accordingly as how much damage Link can take, not to mention how much he can do charged or slow motion arrow attacks, is part of combat strategy. The combat strategy applies to some of the toughest enemies around. Several of the mini-bosses you encounter around the overworld will be familiar to veterans. The Stone Talus creatures return, but using Ascend makes them a little easier to defeat. Hinoxes and Nika clan fighters have barely changed, and Molduga are similar to before, except the changes to using bombs seems to make them harder to beat. Lynels return with their tough fighting stance again. The aforementioned fusing of weapons as well as sage powers can sometimes make them easy, but they are as difficult as ever, especially when they wear armor. This brings us on to the next 3 new faces, starting with Flux constructs seen in the trailers. These large, almost humanoid shapes made of blocks have a variety of attacks and can be more aggressive when they're of a higher tier. These can make traversing the sky in depths more dangerous, but if you can mostly figure out how to weather their athletic attacks, defeating them is a simple and fun time. Foxes are giant frog-like creatures that only exist in the depths. These can be fun to fight and are great for mining Zonite, but they just feel like a mixture of a Hinox and Stone Talus. It is the Gleeoks coming back from past Legend of Zelda games that pose the most memorable challenge. They have more of an attack pattern that can make them easier to defeat than Lynels, but my goodness, defeating them isn't easy. Seeing them from afar didn't make them any less terrifying, and while doing a side quest, I felt like I had to fight my first Gleeok, a Frost Gleeok, one of the Dragon's elemental variants. Early attempts at fighting it didn't go well, and I decided to come back to it later. It took me a few more attempts to figure it out, with using vantage points and slow motion arrow attacks to stun its 3 heads. Then it gets fed up of your shenanigans and goes up high in the sky, where using recoil on giant icicles is the only way to actually be next to it up high. A suitably epic change of battle tactics. When I depleted its health meter and saw it collapse on the ground with its monster parts emerging from its smoking carcass, I let out a yell of excitement and triumph that I rarely ever felt playing almost any other game. There are of course other Gleeoks which can be even more difficult, where one has to be fought on a bridge with little to no vantage points, and don't get me started on the King Gleeok, where each of its 3 heads fight you with all the elements, and aspects that can make the final phase of it being in the sky all the more challenging and even aggravating. But gosh darn it, it feels all the more rewarding when you do defeat it. This does, however, make for the overworld bosses being generally more challenging than the main dungeon bosses. We'll come back to those. Oh wait, I forgot the Gloom Spawn aka Gloom Hands. These are not mini-bosses, but they are horrifying enough to make the guardians of a preceding game look tame in comparison. They are fast and chase after Link to strangle him with the usual negative gloom effects, and to see them in so much as a maze made me run away. Be careful, they can appear almost anywhere. You can defeat them, which is wait, a phantom cannon appears? But don't forget, cooking is back to help with battles. Cooking is helpful again where you have to not only regain health, but also consider stat boosts such as increased speed or defense. Apart from a few new basic ingredients and a handy recipe book, cooking is no different to what it was before, and it's just as beneficial as ever. Not a bad thing. So, collect whatever items you see lying around, including meat and fruit and vegetables. One final point about fusing items. It means that every item you find is just about useful, in contrast to Breath of the Wild where a great many of them had little to no use outside of maybe selling them for rupees. You can also use Ultra Hand inventions on enemies as well, not to mention torture crocs? What is wrong with you people? And if the developers exceeded expectations as mentioned by Zelda Universe packs are any indication, inventions involving spike traps, explosives and so on are big and laughably absurd in how much damage they cause to the toughest creatures, or even make music. Such as the Corridors of Time track from Chrono Trigger. Some of these inventions I couldn't even try to make myself, lest they may be likely to blow up, trial and error be darned sometimes, but at least the game doesn't force you to do this, with the aforementioned situational puzzles I talked about. Now that you understand the abilities, physics and combat, it's time to go over the main quests of dungeons that don't resemble giant mechanical animals as succinctly as possible. If you're not too distracted by the shrines or other bits of side content, the game gently nudges you in the direction of the Rito region, and given you have spicy peppers and of course the cold resistance armor from a Great Sky Island, that makes sense. Note, I got the Rito tunic a bit later as that gives you complete cold resistance over what you get in the Great Sky Island. It can take a little time to realize how the traversal works, as the cloud shown on the map is up in the sky layer. Navigating around the surface, you come across platforms and a series of ships that ascend. And wow! Gliding from platform to platform, usually with companion Talon's help, and using Ascend to get up to higher points is exhilarating. The best part is the shrines that subtly teach you about traversing around that area, using the sails to bounce up as high as possible. In fact, this was such a genius section that I thought for a moment that this was the dungeon. Only you get onto the ship that is, the Wind Temple. It is a dungeon that is simple and challenging at the same time. You have a multi-floor map that is already a callback to earlier Zelda games. It is here you can utilize the situational Ultra Hand concept where items lying around become used or fused to solve puzzles, and you sometimes have to keep your wits about you around enemies. However, it is a similar premise to the dungeons of Breath of the Wild. Press a few switches lying around the map and then be the main boss. While this dungeon and the others do lack the novelty of manipulating the dungeon layout like the winds and so on of a Divine Beast, it is still good fun to explore, and with the traversal mechanics of the contemporary 3D Zelda titles. Plus you have a companion with you, much like two of the dungeons from Zelda the Wind Waker. The boss Kalgera is epic, especially that music, with gliding and diving around while using arrows and so on, though it is relatively easy. And this is what the positive first impression of the main dungeons is. In a similar fashion to Breath of the Wild, it feels like the Rito region is stronger in the quality of the main quests, just like the Zora region was in the preceding game. However, it is still important to note the differences and freedom in the other dungeons. Provided you can survive a volcano or desert, for example, you can still do the other dungeons. The Lightning Temple in the desert was the second one I did. It was easier to get into the Gerudo town than in the previous game because the Gerudo readily trusts Link. The shrines were again a subtle indication of puzzles to come. The protection of Gerudo town against the Gyptos is fun, and leads to high attack power parts dropped from said Gyptos. And the 3 light pillars puzzle is decent, with there being tedium owing to a sandstorm obscuring your map. The Lightning Temple feels like a traditional Legend of Zelda temple, with multiple floors, complete with light puzzles and so on, except you can use Ascend and your paraglider to navigate the floors and actually find the puzzles accordingly. The Queen Gibdo boss, which you can surprisingly fight briefly outside the entrance, is probably one of the harder bosses in the game, owing to the tornadoes and spawning enemies forcing you to multitask. The Fire Temple is less conventional, where the Goron Unibar from the previous game has to be saved from being possessed before you can use him as an explosive projectile against the Baragia that guards the Death Mountain crater. Aerial combat. Star Fox homage, maybe? Anyway, it turns out the Fire Temple is in the depths rather than in the sky or on the ground. The Fire Temple itself is atmospheric and features minecarts as the main method of traversal, which can be occasionally hard to weave the paths of, lest you just simply break the progression of the temple with your other abilities. The boss, Marbled Goma, is way too easy due to Unibar's explosive ability. The Water Temple was completed last, and the lead up to it was lengthy, yet still fairly compelling. There is the acquirement of the Zora armor, reading a broken slate, finding King Dorothan, then firing a King Scout arrow through a hole of debris shaped like a tear, and navigating the ancient waterworks and water bubble-filled Wellspring Island. It is a shame, however, that the Water Temple is just the weakest main dungeon in Tears of the Kingdom. It is in the sky like the Wind Temple, and definitely not as interesting in terms of design. The puzzles are blander, the low gravity and water bubbles drag the pace down, and the boss Muktarok is not necessarily that epic. Anyway, that's all 4 regional dungeons completed. It's time for the game to challenge the expectations of Breath of the Wild veterans. You think that Hyrule Castle is where the final battle takes place? Think again. Zelda is spotted at the castle from afar. How is that possible? Still, there you fight off monster forces, phantom Ganons, and find out, and in a scene that is a positively surprising work of linear progression in an open world game, that the Zelda you've been mostly seeing around the world is a puppet. Therefore, the regular cast of characters deduced from the ancestors of the current sages that Zelda spoke to is that there is another sage around somewhere. Starting with the ruins in Kakariko Village, which had an annoying invisible forbidden zone at first, mind you. You go to Dragonhead Island and Thunderhead Isles kitted with some shock resistance garb at least 10 hearts, and then find the 5th and most tricky dungeon of all in the depths, a construct factory and spirit temple, where you have to find 4 missing pieces for a construct made by Mineru. The puzzles to get these pieces that focus on using Ultra Hand in sometimes even more bizarre ways, and bizarre enough even that one puzzle was too hard to figure out, are the most challenging yet, and the reward is the 5th sage. We'll cover the first 4 shortly. The 5th sage is a tall, almost mech-like construct that Link can ride and use for many devices, such as flame emitters, on the melee arms. When Link was riding this thing and eventually got into some kind of wrestling match with a seized construct under the Spirit Temple, I was generally thinking, am I actually playing a Legend of Zelda game? No matter, it was still pretty cool. It is with the mention of the 5th sage that one has to note the main rewards you get from completing each of these regional dungeons. A Sage Power. These effectively replace the champion powers from Breath of the Wild, so say goodbye to Revali's Gale and even Mytha's Grace. These are represented by spirits of sages that follow Link around whenever you need their ability or passively hurt nearby enemies. Talon's Wind ability is easily the perfect ability, as it generates a gust of wind that helps with paragliding further, which further emphasizes the vertical, rather than horizontal, exploration in the open world. Unibar's fire ability is the aforementioned explosive force that can be used almost as a projectile against enemies and breakable rocks, sometimes fired from Ultra Hand vehicles. This can usually be used instead of rock hammers, provided you can wait for this sage ability to recharge. Sidon's water ability and Riju's lightning ability, these are purely situational in combat where water shields and projectiles, not to mention the electrical field that allows for explosive damage if an arrow hits something within the radius. Mineru's construct again allows you to fuse objects for combat and traversal, plus you can ride on it through gloom and lava. These abilities are all fine, except for 2 problems. The water and lightning abilities are very situational, with the other 3 being more useful. Also, if you have more than one sage out, which you may want to use in hectic combat situations, trying to press A next to one to use an ability is rarely precise. You can switch off the Sage abilities in the menu so you don't accidentally activate Talon's Gust, but surely some kind of hotkey to instantly use an ability could have been included. Still, the main dungeons and to an extent the Sage abilities are an improvement over their equivalents in Breath of the Wild. Sure, you press 4 switches again like in a Divine Beast, and the dungeons are, for the most part, lacking in length and complexity, but the relative freedom in an exploration/traversal and puzzle solving, not to mention the different aesthetics and atmospheres, show a good starting point when improving dungeons in the next 3D entry of the Legend of Zelda series. And a possible counterpoint about these dungeons is that they're not overlong and restricted with locked doors and such, but that depends on your interest in the older games. The story was certainly a matter of concern again when it looked like Tears of the Kingdom was going to be just as open, if not more so, than Breath of the Wild. Plot points happened in a specific order in past Zelda games, and this huge and open Zelda game was not going to do that. In fact, I had vaguely heard some hours after starting the game that you could complete the game in less than 2 hours and get to the final boss quickly. So, this confirmed to me that after the first section or so, you didn't need to go through the main quests or even side quests and could see the end credits very quickly, provided you had your wits about you with little to no items or experience from exploring the world as thoroughly as you wanted. However, the use of environmental/passive storytelling, cutscenes, and the mixtures of these that were used exceptionally well in Breath of the Wild come back, and it's still a great idea, but it has some noticeable twists. First of all, the storyline. What was seen as far back as the 2019 teasers occurs where a mummified Ganondorf awakens and makes Hyrule Castle rise into the sky, causing Zelda and Link to be separated. Zelda goes back through time, and Link is rescued by a disembodied arm, keeping Ganondorf in place, which replaces Link's right arm that was corrupted by Ganondorf in that moment. This leads to Link getting the Zonai powers around the Great Sky Island with the help of the spirit of the Zonai King, Rauru. After this, Link explores 4 regions like in the last game and investigates disturbances partially connected to mysterious sightings of a titled princess gone missing. Before going over what happens at the 4 main regions in terms of plot, let's go over a storytelling format that is brought back from the past game, the backstory told through memories. You do go to several locations throughout the land, getting these memory cutscenes, but instead of looking at photos given to an amnesiac Link and figuring out where these were taken, you go to these bright geoglyphs that are easily visible from afar, not to mention hinted at in the obviously named Forgotten Temple. This can be considered a downgrade in terms of exploration, regardless of the geoglyphs being big enough so that you don't see the shaded tier right away, but it's still tantalizing being distracted by that geoglyph from afar and seeing what these cutscenes are about. One of the coolest teasers about these memories is that they take place in the distant past, a potentially interesting look at Legend of Zelda lore for fans, and that they are just that. Memories. We'll come back to that. The memories in Breath of the Wild were fun to watch and were mostly well presented, but ended up being a little too vague or repetitive in regards to the characterizations and journeys of Zelda and Link. However, the showing over telling that is Storytelling 101 lends itself well to Zelda's simple motivation to get back to the present, with the help of King Rauru and Queen Sonia. Here we learn that Ganondorf tried and failed to conquer Hyrule with brute force and instead sought to use the secret stones of the Zonai. Rauru's arrogance in trying to defeat Ganondorf, and not back to Ganondorf's swearing fealty before the King in Ocarina of Time, leads to Queen Sonia's death and the secret stone turning Ganondorf into the near unstoppable Demon King that commands an army of monsters. Only with the help of Zelda, Rauru, and a few other sages can the descendants and their powers in the present day aid Link in stopping Ganondorf and maybe finding Zelda. The cutscenes are generally well presented and fun to watch beyond the somewhat heavy exposition about some sense of magic realism for the stones and special powers, the occasionally cheesy nature, and the confusing placement in the Zelda timeline, all of which are general aspects of a Legend of Zelda series that can either be ignored or scrutinized a lot. After all, does the founding of Hyrule under the rule of Rauru's Sonia help with clarifying the timeline at all? These cutscenes also don't provide the option to make Princess Zelda a playable character, as was speculated or hoped for, a missed opportunity before DLC perhaps? Oh, the best part, however, is the foreshadowing. If these are cutscenes taking place in the distant past, how are they memories exactly? And how are they the title tears. This is a simple plot twist, but it works. It's not something that is out of nowhere. There are breadcrumbs that can make you exclaim, "Oh, now I get it." If the quest title for Dragon's Tears is any indication, it is clarified that these memories are tears from the eye of a dragon that Zelda turned herself into using the Secret Stone, a forbidden and irreversible act that still was done to restore the Master Sword for Link in the future. Seeing the last 12th memory out of the first 11 and holding the Master Sword atop Dragon Zelda's head is a suitably epic moment accommodating this twist. Additionally, these cutscenes feature voice acting, and it has to be noted that while the English dub is not that bad, the Japanese dub is easily better. Listen to when Rauru says,
"Don't be so smug. I know exactly what it will cost me."
It is what happens outside of these memories, however, that the plot is a little lacking. Repetitive, in fact. Each ending of the dungeons, almost regardless of the somewhat different characterizations that define the different races, results in almost the exact same dialogue about the imprisoning war involving the Sage's secret stones, Rauru sacrificing himself to seal Ganondorf away, and Zelda requesting the same help from each of the Sages to aid Link in the future. I understand that this is supposed to accommodate the dungeons being completed in any order the player wants, or that they may not even complete all of them, but even Breath of the Wild had a little more variation of the dialogue that appears after a dungeon boss is defeated. One of the more surprising in-depth plot moments is the aforementioned revelation in Hyrule Castle of Zelda being a puppet in the present day, complete with Ganondorf showing a what-if moment if he happens to take over the world. You cannot even see this scene unless you complete all 4 main dungeons and then go to Hyrule Castle with all 4 sages fighting alongside Link. So, what about the environmental/passive storytelling then? Well, it is divisive sometimes. In fact, the Zonai from ages ago being key to the founding of Hyrule is tantalizing for Legend of Zelda lore, but you don't find out much about them in the long run. Rauru and Sonia's marriage was an unconventional, yet relaxed and sometimes quirky one of a Zonai and an Hylian in ancient times. They created the Shrines of Light that were designed to seal monsters away instead of the ancient shrines from before that were designed to train the hero for the fight against Calamity Ganon. Sonia and Princess Zelda are obviously connected. The Zonai created temples and ancient tablets to go up into the sky. In fact, it is through these ancient tablets in a long-running side quest that you find out more of this information outside of the memory tiers, which I surprisingly did very late in the game. More about the Zonai could have been shown or revealed, but then again you have to remember that part of the word Zonai is Japanese and translates to the word mystery in English. Much of the lore and timeline patterns of The Legend of Zelda are not exactly clarified or, depending on who you ask, worth even scrutinizing over, so it is up to interpretation. In fact, it can make one wonder, where are the divine beasts? Where are the ancient shrines? How do the Shrines of Light replace them? Note, the developers may have considered these questions a deliberate mystery. The final main quest chapter in the lead up to the final boss is also very awkwardly designed. What that means is that the developers couldn't seem to decide whether it was obvious where Ganondorf was, or if it turns out he's actually in a more obscure location and you had to find him. For one thing, Pura says you should talk to Joshua to figure out the location. At this moment, Joshua was investigating the Yuga clan's presence in the depths, a generally optional side adventure, not a main quest. Seeing this, I got a little impatient and went below Hyrule Castle to see if Ganondorf was down in those depths. He seemed to be, but it was a hard area, so I decided to prepare some more and at least complete the Yuga clan side quest. This quest is mostly fun to do, but has an awkward ending. When you come across the final encounter with Master Koga of the Yuga clan, he says Ganondorf is below Hyrule Castle. Obviously, you defeat him, resulting in an almost slapstick death. The nice constructs are grateful for their mining facilities having no Yuga clan interference. You return to Joshua and Link tells her nothing. Silent protagonist, am I right? So why wasn't the Yuga clan maybe a main quest? Why was it a side quest connected to Joshua possibly helping you with finding Ganondorf, let alone researching the location in the depths? And why did Pura say, "Why didn't you say so," while you held on to the Master Sword for the longest time? To be fair, this is an awkward progression that a non-linear open world structure may not really be able to make work. But whether it was getting the Master Sword atop Drake and Zelda, or not trying to say to the player, hey, that obvious spot that you think is the depths below Hyrule Castle is actually not the location of the final boss, this design made little to no sense. Still, the depths below Hyrule Castle can be reached straight away, much like Hyrule Castle in the previous game, and no matter how much exploration or experience you've gone through, it's time for the final fight. What lies below Hyrule Castle is a smaller area than the royal location above, but gloom and tough enemies abound, so you have to keep your wits about you, and gloom-resistant armors and items, if you hope to even beat the Demon King's army. After that is Ganondorf himself, who, despite the more conventional look in terms of design, which is still pretty cool as his voice, is mostly tougher than Calamity Ganon from before, least of all because he can attack with gloom and especially dodge most of your sword attacks. Plus, Ganondorf's health meter expands to almost going off a screen in the second phase. Way to go, Nintendo. The first part of his extended health meter can be easy to deplete if you have the sages with you, least of all being able to jump off Minoru's construct and do slow motion arrow attacks. But for the last part of the second phase, you're on your own. Just do your attacks, including your flurry rushes, and even use or conserve your gloom recovery items, and you've checked a defeated Ganondorf off your list. Well, not quite. Yes, much like the ending of Breath of the Wild, you go up against the biggest, baddest, and most terrifying Ganondorf/Ganon/Finny/Beastie that roams the skies, Demon Dragon Ganondorf. The Demon King's villainous act of swallowing the secret stone to turn himself into a dragon makes him easy to beat. Almost more so than Dark Beast Ganon from before, with easier to avoid projectiles. Dragon Zelda is there to prevent Link from falling off, and you get to use the Master Sword on visible hit spots on the Demon Dragon while you hear awesome music. You almost cannot get more epic for an end fight in a Legend of Zelda game than that. Now for the ending after the final blow. The spirits of Rauru and Sonia turn Zelda back into her proper form and restore Link's arm. Make of that what you will, but you cannot deny the emotional catharsis of Link diving down to save a falling Zelda and you grabbing her hand with a press of the A button. Safely on the ground, Zelda begins to realize everything that's happened, including the Master Sword coming back to Link, and begins to tell Link about her time in the past and everyone she met, which you of course would have seen for yourself if you got all the memory tears. So that's it? Credits and nothing else? Well, just like in the last game, doing all the main quests earns you the secret ending, taking place up in the Temple of Time in the sky. This clarifies a little more about how Rauru and Sonia helped Link and Zelda after the final boss fight. Plus, before Minoru has to essentially fade away, the four sages alongside Purah and Link make a vow, awkwardly at first, to protect the land of Hyrule, which Zelda equates with her and the ancestors in the past, also vowing to restore peace. All this with a great remix of Zelda's Lullaby and the main Legend of Zelda theme in the background, and that's the ending. It feels more final than the one in Breath of the Wild, but other Legend of Zelda games have had better endings than this one, which feels mostly like a clarification and the sum of the journey you, the player, went on, rather than reach the destination. But wait! You actually can return to your save file and see how many quests/memories/etc. you've missed out on. Which brings me to the conclusion of what I generally focused on in terms of side content, thinking about my overall journey that you've been looking at so far, haven't you? And determining this game's quality and legacy for the Legend of Zelda series, or indeed, gaming as a whole. The side content makes more sense to talk about here, as I played more of the game after defeating Ganondorf and thought more about this game's legacy and quality. Don't get me wrong, side quests that were completed prior to the Demon King's defeat would extend any playing session for hours without realizing it. One of the most memorable quests was the Longmai Labyrinth, with a free act structure. This is one of the similar looking mazes seen from the previous game, except a voice essentially keeps on telling you that the quest isn't over before you eventually go to a labyrinth in the sky and then go through a center hole to the depths below to fight a flux construct free. I remember coming across this construct and going, wait, I cannot fight you now, I need to pause the game and get something to eat first. That is how much the game keeps on giving. The long-running side quest of the newspaper sightings of Princess Zelda feels like a better elaboration on the Tarry Town construction from last time. It is through here that you see the new stable point system, for horses being a little more useful, and even see that the Grey Fairies want musicians to wake them up? That was unexpected after last time. For the most part, the side content is just there for the fun of it, including the President Hudson signs that are littered around the world. Link has to keep them standing using whatever Ultra Hand materials are nearby, which is mostly easy to do, save for a few twists. However, you get little more than food/elixirs and some rupees, which of course is somewhat normal for the side content in not only this game and its predecessor, but open world games in general. But at least, the side quests feel like far better journeys and you care about the characters who comment on what you do. You read these characters' journals and realize how compelling the rebuilding of the land actually is. It makes the world feel lived in. What is also important to note, whether it's through side content or not, is collectibles. The Korok seeds return and are barely more tantalizing than before, except there are 1,000 of them instead of 900. This number increase is due to the Korok escort missions, where Koroks have trouble getting to their friend from afar, less Link can help and usually with Ultra Hand. Some of these escorts, which get you 2 seeds instead of 1, and of course much of the random Korok hunting is fun, but for me, I just prefer to collect as many as I like or randomly come across to increase my inventory slots. Yay, more bows so I can fire whatever kind of elemental arrows I want. None of that special arrow stuff from last time. Rupees are valuable, especially for getting armor sets. Other armor sets can be just found, sometimes on a quest, and the most notable of these are the callbacks to the past games. Oh hey, it's a Majora's Mask one, Wind Waker, Twilight Princess. These unfortunately cannot be upgraded by great fairies, and outside of the rare occasions of little bonuses or just an aesthetic costume for Link, are rarely useful. And speaking of the great fairies, it feels great to upgrade your armor sets the more you see the fairies after helping musicians in a long-running side quest. You will, however, need a lot of items and rupees to upgrade these armor sets, and even then, changing back and forth between these can be a little cumbersome regardless of dividing armor sets by category on the menu. One of the weirdest collectibles, however, are the Sage's Wheels. There are only 20 of them and only in the sky, 4 of them for each of the 5 sages that accompany Link. It is cool to find them in the hardest locations up in the clouds, but they do little more to the sage other than increase their attack power slightly. It would have been interesting if, for example, maybe Talon's Gust could be more powerful, which to be fair would really break the game. Speaking of breaking the game, DLC. It's been confirmed that what was made for Breath of the Wild as an expansion pass / additional content, etc., is not going to be a thing for Tears of the Kingdom. There is a small star-shaped sky island that I initially assumed had a stone tablet for an aforementioned side quest, but it's almost impossible to get to with the best will in the world, that is your best Ultra Hand vehicles and all the Zonai charges and cells to keep them running, a concept which also doesn't break the game. Instead, that island is empty. And again, what about a playable Zelda? Is it possible to add a little more quest or challenge things like last time? And Cass, I miss Cass. Whether Master Mode should be included or not is debatable in quality, and even then, it feels like making the game harder would be difficult to implement. It is nice, however, that items behind the previous DLC paywall, such as the Hero's Path UI, Travel Medallion, Korok Mask and so on, can be attained fairly early on through exploration and quests. And the question of DLC is the segue to the most important questions that will essentially conclude this whole review, this whole journey. Is The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom purely DLC rather than a sequel? How does it shape up alongside other Zelda games, open world games and games in general? How good of a game is it? Well, hopefully the answers have somewhat been answered in both this video and in part 1, where I tried not to spoil anything and talk basically about the production values, gameplay mechanics, and how it felt to play it. Even to this day, with all the familiarity, the amazing impact of this game has barely dropped. Even after getting to the ending, I have found surprises in the world or seen the unexpected. Part of me wants to go back and see what I missed, or maybe forgot to talk about in this review, especially the Korok seeds, and maybe even skip most of the game on a second playthrough to do the final section differently, even if the first playthrough is purely the most magical. It was magical in how the earliest puzzles clicked because of the 4 new abilities, or how the puzzles had multiple solutions, or how the towers were more fun and useful this time, or how exhilarating it was to traverse the ships surrounding the Wind Temple. All this and much more, up to the final moments where Link sunk the Master Sword into Ganondorf's skull and grabbed Princess Zelda's hand, is the quintessential Legend of Zelda experience. but is it really? Both this game and its predecessor, despite loosely borrowing the open-ended nature of the very first game of the series, are so different, the sequel more so. Like constructing vehicles, that's surely not a Legend of Zelda game, is it? Outside of references, even just using the name alone of the imprisoning wall from A Link to the Past, this game may as well be its own thing. It is its own thing, complete with questionable problems such as potential balancing issues with combat of using weapons, the overwhelming nature at the beginning, the occasionally too familiar parts of the overworld, a few of the storytelling elements, the slightly lacking new map designs, the somewhat repetitive ratio of the shrine puzzles / quests, the main dungeons mostly lacking in length and complexity despite their scope of freedom, the sometimes cumbersome and unrewarding side content, the subjectively finicky ultra hand constructions, even with the auto build ability and Yuka clan schematics. Couldn't even mention them anywhere else in this review. And finally, the performance issues epitomized by Link trying to go up a chasm alongside a big rideable dragon, that which really slows the game down. Despite all these flaws, The Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom is an easily more than exceptional game. There is so much inventiveness and fun moments and compelling gameplay loops, all within a well-designed framework of letting the player achieve their goals in almost any way they want, that add up to a memorable experience, all of which can make Breath of the Wild look like a tech demo or starting point before the developers filled in the puzzles and freedom in gameplay mechanics. In the preceding game, you started off at the Great Plateau. Now you can see how changed it is, and somehow feel like you're coming home to Hyrule. But is it possible to even go back to the preceding game? Is it possible to say that Breath of the Wild is still a revolutionary novelty, even if its sequel may be better? And overall, is this game for Breath of the Wild veterans then? Well, depending on who you ask, some disliked that game and prefer its sequel, or vice versa. Or you introduce someone who has not played the preceding game, maybe even a Legend of Zelda or open world experience in their life, to this Nintendo Switch game, and it's possible that their adventure, their experience, their approach, the story they weave across this massive virtual content-filled playground will be different to yours and unlike anything else in gaming. Heck, the puff shrooms in the gameplay demonstration. I barely used them. Did I make the game harder or did I just forget? Nah, that's just what I felt like doing. In fact, this game was so much fun that I charted almost every session of this game and how I felt and reacted while playing, like it was an adventure story, a diary, a journal, and not an ordinary footage log. This game is not DLC. What was experimented with in building upon the preceding formula couldn't be done with a previous story and exploration as shown here. Oh, and I almost forgot probably many of the quality of life improvements, such as the loading screens being shorter while actually showing the map, which is nice, and being able to automatically drop weapons and shields when opening a chest. The new abilities are not likely to return in the next 3D Legend of Zelda game, and the main dungeons are a step in the right direction for what lies ahead. A step, but only a step. Until we know more about the future of open world games, the Legend of Zelda series, or gaming in general, one can rest assured in the knowledge that, no matter how one feels subjectively about the Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, it is quite possibly one of the greatest games of 2023 and maybe of much of gaming history. And that, everyone, is the end of my part 2 of my Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom review. I say that this recent Legend of Zelda game was my favourite game of the year 2023, and yet I look forward to what gaming in 2024 will bring. But who knows how much, if at all, I will talk about it or retro games or something on this channel. The long break begins. But how long? One day, I may come back. Maybe I'll come back. Until then, have a good day or night or whatever it is. Hope you had a good year 2023 and have a good rest of the year 2024.